Assalamu alaikum. May peace, blessings, and mercy of Allah Ta'ala be upon you. In this video, we will be talking about the important topics of Section F, Fraud Risk of CIA Part 1, Essentials of the Internal Auditing. Section F has the weightage of 10% in exams. We can expect around 13 questions from this section. The definition of fraud is important. Fraud is defined as any illegal act characterized by deceit, concealment, or violation of trust. These acts are not dependent upon the threat of violence or physical force. Frauds are perpetrated by parties and organizations to obtain money, property, or services, to avoid payment or loss of services, or to secure personal or business advantage. The difference between fraud and error is of intention. If the act performed is unintentional, then it is an error. However, if an act is performed with intention, then it is a fraud. There are three types of fraud: fraudulent financial reporting, misappropriation of assets, and the corruption. There must be three conditions necessary for committing a fraud. Number one, the person must be motivated to commit the fraud. Number two, the person must have the opportunity to commit the fraud. Number three, the person must be able to rationalize the fraud. Collectively, these three elements are called the fraud triangle. If the company can eliminate any of these three elements, the likelihood of fraud occurring is greatly reduced. Management has the responsibility to establish and maintain an effective control system. The internal auditor is responsible for examining the controls to determine if they are adequate to prevent or detect fraud, as well as looking for occurrences of the fraud. However, the internal auditor is not responsible for preventing fraud. Override of controls occurs when management overrides or in some way circumvents the controls in place in order to commit the fraud. This is the limitation of the internal control system. There are 5 key steps of fraud risk assessment. Number 1, identify relevant fraud risk factors. Number 2, identify potential fraud schemes and prioritize them based on the risk. Number 3, map existing controls to potential fraud schemes and identify gaps. Number 4, test operating effectiveness of fraud prevention and detection controls. And number 5, document and report the fraud risk assessment. Red flag is anything that strongly suggests that an unethical or suspicious event has taken place, or is a situation that would enable fraud to take place without detection. If there is a reasonable certainty that fraud has occurred, the Chief Audit Executive should notify the appropriate management level, usually the Audit Committee and perhaps also the Board of Directors. Management then makes the decision whether or not to start an investigation. If there is a reasonable certainty that fraud has occurred, the Chief Audit Executive should notify the appropriate management level, usually the Audit Committee and perhaps also the Board of the Directors. Management then makes the decision whether or not to start an investigation. It is generally not the auditor's duty to report fraud to individuals outside of the organization.